Welcome. My name is Melissa Kane, and I'm a member of the board of BigTentUSA. And I'm so honored to welcome Congressman Jamie Raskin and Brennan Center Fellow Caroline Fredrickson to BigTentUSA for what I know is going to be a fascinating conversation and an excellent kickoff to debate night. There are only 130 days until the election, and we at BigTentUSA are urging everyone to do something. We have a number of civic engagement opportunities available through our website, including writing letters to voters in key states and signing up to be a poll worker. So please check out the links that are in the chat to learn more and to sign up. I am truly thrilled to introduce tonight's spotlight speakers. Congressman Jamie Raskin is a prominent constitutional law professor and the U.S. representative. Hello, Representative Raskin, the U.S. representative for Maryland's 8th Congressional District. Currently, he serves as the ranking member on the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability. Congressman Raskin was the lead House manager in the second Senate impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump, which ended with a 57-43 vote to convict the president for inciting a violent insurrection against the government to overthrow the 2020 presidential election. Congressman Raskin also served on the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Representative Raskin is known for his passionate advocacy for democracy and civil rights and brings his extensive knowledge of American law and governance to tonight's conversations. Hello, Representative Raskin.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa.
I'm glad you're here. Caroline Fredrickson is a senior fellow, hi Caroline, at the Brennan Center for Justice and a renowned expert on democracy and law. Caroline served as the president of the American Constitution Society from 2009 to 2019, during which time she helped grow ACS, which now has thousands of members throughout the nation. She regularly contributes opinion pieces to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other news outlets. She's the author of several books, including Under the Bus, How Working Women Are Being Run Over, and The Democracy Fix, How to Win the Fight for Fair Rules, Fair Courts, and Fair Elections. Representative Raskin, I know you have to jump off at about 8:30, but Caroline is going to be available after that to answer some questions. So without further ado, welcome Caroline and Representative Raskin. We are so happy you're here.
Great. Well, thanks, Melissa. And I think what I understand is that I have the wonderful job of being able to engage with my very own Congressman Raskin in a conversation about some of the key issues that are at stake. I mean, we couldn't be doing this on a better night, and I think this is definitely a kind of a pre-game run up with one of the people who's been really at the foreground of highlighting what is before us in this election and why should the American people care so much. And a couple of the areas I think we're going to focus on most tonight are something that areas that Congressman Raskin has done a tremendous amount. And then one is on, what would a second Trump administration look like? And Project 2025 in particular, as well as the Supreme Court that he's already created, how bad it's been and how much worse it could become. It's hard to imagine, really. What can we do about it? So Congressman Raskin, it's great to be with you this evening. And I guess I just wanted to open it up and say, and ask you, tell us a little bit about your work on Project 2025. What is it? What's at stake? And why should people care?
So, Caroline, thank you so much. And I'm delighted to have this conversation with you. Before I, get into the chamber of horrors that is Project 2025, let's take the other side. Let's take what we're fighting for in this election and why the Supreme Court is at the center of our ability to get anything done. I mean, let's say that we're actually able to capture concurrent bicameral majorities and maintain the White House, and we pass national legislation to restore Roe versus Wade. Right now, 1/3 of the women in America, tens of millions of women, live in red Handmaid's Tale states, where the legislators are not only trying to criminalize abortion and have succeeded in doing that, but want to criminalize the act of crossing state lines in order to get health care. Assume that we did what I think every Democrat has signed on to now, which is to codify Roe versus Wade and to establish a woman's right to have an abortion in consultation with her physician. Assume that we're able to repair the damage of Shelby County versus Holder, which ripped the heart out of the Voting Rights Act, and we're able to restore the pre-clearance mechanism in the district courts in the District of Columbia and the coverage formula. Assume we're able to do all of that, and assume we're able to get all of the college student loan relief we want to get. The Supreme Court could very easily, this Supreme Court could overturn it all and say, no, this is not within Congress's powers under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment to guarantee women's right to choose. It's not within Congress's powers to guarantee voting rights. It's not congruent and proportional under the new straitjacket test developed by the right-wing majority on the court. And for whatever reason, there can't be college student relief because, this is a court that will just pull a new doctrine out of a hat like a magician, So basically everything that we're fighting for, which I think we're going to be able to do because of the mobilization of people around the country, all of that is threatened by the Supreme Court. Now, on the other side, if, God forbid the worst were to happen, think of it this way. Donald Trump says he wants to start by rounding up millions of immigrants in the country in detention camps and then deporting them. He wants to convert the Department of Justice into an instrument of vengeance and retribution and revenge. And that's not my characterization. Those are his words. That's what he's talking about doing, including talking about going after the members of the January 6th Select Committee. So you can be certain that he got my attention with that one. But he's talking about going after the Biden family. He's talking about basically anybody who he feels has crossed him. And that's a hallmark of authoritarianism and dictatorship, not democracy. But he's being very open about that. They're claiming that the DOJ is weaponized against the Republicans, which is farcical. Right now, the Department of Justice is prosecuting a Democratic senator in New Jersey, a Democratic congressman in Texas, and the Democratic president's son. And they're whining about the fact that Donald Trump is a convicted felon now in New York because of a prosecution by a local DA in state court. But that's just the beginning of it. They want a national ban on abortion because, of course, their doctrine, which they have stuck to for decades, is that abortion is murder. And I sat there for years with them describing abortion as a Holocaust, abortion as genocide. That's the real doctrine. The cat's got their tongue recently as they've seen voters across the country turn against that twisted and perverted doctrine. But that's totally where they want to go. And they know that they've activated the right-wing white Christian nationalists, and that's who they're taken to the ball with them. So they will do that. They're talking about dismantling a huge number of social programs in the country that people depend on. They want to attack Social Security. They want to attack Medicare. They want to attack Medicaid. They want to abolish the Department of Education, which means the Title I spending that helps to mitigate some of the tremendous wealth inequality in the country. They would basically go after NATO and our other democratic alliances, pull the plug on the people of Ukraine, take Vladimir Putin's side in his filthy imperialist war against the democratic government of Ukraine. And he would side with dictators and autocrats all over the world, which is why, the autocrats in Moscow and, the theocrats in Saudi Arabia and in MAGA and every strongman and dictator is on the side of the kleptocrat from Mar-a-Lago.
But, Congressman, I just interrupt you for a second because it just to underscore that point, because as one of the classes that I teach is a comparative constitutional law and challenges to liberal democracies. And it is exactly that. The game plan, this Project 2025 that you've done so much to expose, is really the playbook by which Orban and other autocrats around the world have used to undermine any type of opposition, right? And so it means that the executive branch becomes not an instrument for all of us to have our needs taken care of, to represent the members of our community, to take to address core social needs like health and security and the environment, protecting us against gun violence, for example, but instead becomes personalized, right? What Donald Trump is doing is he's personalizing the administration, kneecapping what Congress is trying to do in any way, shape, or form with the help of the Supreme Court, but then turning the executive branch into something that, as you said, is an instrument of retribution against his enemies, as well as a means of advancing these policies that the vast majority of Americans are simply absolutely committed to opposing.
They want to demolish the civil service and strip civil service protections from tens of thousands of employees and positions that would then be filled with this army of sycophants to loyally follow Donald Trump's orders on everything from driving him to the Capitol to join the mob, to storm the Capitol and overturn the constitutional order, to matters of whim, like, oh, he's going to whip out his Sharpie and change the direction of a hurricane just because he's convinced that that's where it is, and anybody at NOAA or the National Weather Service who dares challenge him will just be gone at that point. He was very frustrated that he couldn't just sack the professional scientists who were telling him that that was crazy. So he is going to decree the official truth, and this is the unitary executive, the idea that the president decides everything in the executive branch, as opposed to the president having a very specific job under Article 1, which is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, the laws adopted by Congress.
Right, and just to say, I know we've already evoked the Supreme Court and how much it has already done to undermine Congress, and the prospect that even if Congress comes back fully into the hands of the Democrats and the Democrats move to address these major national problems, and I would add gun violence certainly to the issues that you mentioned earlier. The Supreme Court has just today already gone further in the direction of this unitary executive theory with the Jarchese decision, which joins a whole series of other decisions in which the Supreme Court has really made it hard for Congress to adopt legislation in major areas that set out a framework for the agencies to then move forward on the environment. We also had a really terrible case on EPA's issue regulation to control downstate pollution, but now with the SEC being kneecapped and not being able to use administrative law judges, it really makes it extremely hard to go after people who are defrauding us and bankers who are stealing from their customers or manipulating securities laws. But this has been a series of cases in which the Supreme Court is walking down this line of saying, we need to live in the 1920s before we had agencies that could do anything, and anything else is unconstitutional. Well, I think everybody needs to understand what that means to have a federal government that is basically not just ill-equipped, but not equipped at all, not permitted to to follow policies.
They pretend as if the attack is on unelected, unaccountable agency bureaucrats. It's really against Congress and the laws of the people. Congress embodies the essential will of the people in passing a Clean Air Act or a Clean Water Act, but we're not able to define the precise terms of what particulates and what chemicals can be dumped into the water at what point of the year and so on. Like, all of that comes down to regulation. And so by kneecapping the regulators and substituting the Supreme Court's policy preferences, they're disabling the ability of Congress to implement the will of the people.
That's right, absolutely. And I think one of the other areas that you've highlighted is sort of what's gone wrong with the Supreme Court. And we talk and we can talk a fair amount about outcomes. I just did want to say a couple things about that point, and maybe you want to describe what we can do about it. But I mean, we've had a few cases where people can be misled that the Supreme Court's not nearly as radical as it is. For example, the Rahimi case, which said that somebody who has a domestic violence restraining order against him can be legally and constitutionally prohibited from having a gun, because guess what? It was somehow analogous to what occurred in the 18th century, as if that should be a standard for federal regulation of gun ownership. But then they go ahead and issue this bump stock decision, completely undercutting the idea that this is a rational court at all on guns. And so we have, and then I'd say in the abortion context, of course, you have two cases recently that are basically punts. One is, and they're both dealing with whether a case is ripe or whether they're standing. On the emergency abortion case, which apparently they are going to say that Idaho can't enforce its law that basically condemns women to die if they have a pregnancy that has gone wrong and need abortion care. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about, what we should be doing about this court and how we should understand these cases in the context of what it's already done.
Well, you've got a court which articulates completely malleable and manipulable standards. I mean, that's basically what originalism is. I mean, if you look at the Second Amendment cases, sometimes they will say, well, we'll compare the originalist approach to the Second Amendment to the religious originalist approach to abortion, right? They'll say, well, was the right of abortion one that was on the minds of the framers of the 14th Amendment when it was written? But they don't say, well, were assault weapons on the mind of the framers of the Second Amendment when that was written? There they say, oh, were there laws on the books against assault weapons, right? And they don't say, were there laws on the books against abortion? So those doctrines are completely manipulable and results oriented, as we've seen. And sometimes when they fear they've gone too far and they know that they have struck the rock, which is women, and they know that the country is in a full-scale uproar backlash against their terrible Dobbs decision, at that point they put on the brakes and they say, whoa, 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 we don't want a decision out there saying that we're putting guns back in the hands of domestic abusers, which of course they've done all over the country, because that's what it is to say anybody can go out and buy an AR-15. You have to be in a state that tries to block that in order to get them out of the hands of a domestic abuser. But in any event, they can say that goes too far. We'll put on the brakes at that point. But I think everybody knows they've given the game away. Donald Trump is all over the country bragging about the fact that he stacked the court with right-wing Federalist Society judges with the purpose of overturning Dobbs. And now it's that same Supreme Court, which has, of course, intervened repeatedly in this presidential election by plucking away the presidential immunity question and putting a complete stop to what's going on with the Jack Smith prosecution in the District of Columbia.
Well, why don't you talk about that for a minute, just because I know, Jamie, we don't have you for that much longer, but think about a couple of cases which could not be more existential for all of us, but especially for you, who was in the building, who were in the building and on January 6th. I think we need to make sure we don't have collective amnesia about these cases simply because the Supreme Court has been punting them for so long. So, where are we with those?
Well, but I was really shocked at the way the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment case, the Colorado case, the Anderson versus Trump case came out. I mean, to me, this is textbook textualism and textbook originalism. There is no way anyone from the 5th grade up can read Section 3 of the 14th Amendment in any other way than it was intended, which is that anyone who has sworn an oath to support the Constitution of the United States who engages in insurrection or rebellion shall never be allowed to hold federal or state office again. And Colorado engaged in excruciating fact-finding on the question and decided. And then the court just blew the whole thing up. I mean, which shows you how far to the right everything has gone. It just makes sense.
And in fairly short order, right? It didn't take them very long to answer that one.
Oh, no, they took care of that one real quickly, like at Bush versus Gore speed, at Josh Hawley speed, they blew that one up. But that's certainly not the way they've been working on the presidential immunity question, which I think has a vast consensus. Probably the real right-wing professors are, in bed with Trump on this one. But the vast majority of academics and observers and judges would tell you that's an easy case. We have never believed the president of the United States, much less the former president of the United States, is somehow immune to criminal liability and prosecution for the things that he does in office. In fact, when I was over in the Senate, Caroline, for the second impeachment trial, that was the argument being offered by Trump's lawyers.
Mhm.
The whole time they were saying the way to deal with this is just prosecute him in court. If there's violation of real criminal statutes, just violate him. There's nothing that keeps you from prosecuting him. That was their argument. That was the reason that Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. Remember, he granted him that pardon so he would not be criminally prosecuted. That's why Bill Clinton entered into a voluntary agreement to lose his bar license for 5 years so he wouldn't be criminally prosecuted. The questions far more trivial that were raised during his investigation by Ken Starr. And now suddenly they want to turn the whole thing upside down and say, no, there really is somebody above the law, and that's the president of the United States. And the very stable right-wing geniuses on the Supreme Court say, well, this is complicated, and we're not just going to figure out this case or controversy. We're not just going to look at this. We're going to render an advisory theoretical opinion on any conceivable thing that would come down the road, and
Right.
then pronounce upon it.
What I think is really incredible is that, you're right. I mean, they sort of distanced themselves from the president that we had, the one who was actually did the things that we're talking about and tried to extrapolate to a set of very insignificant types of hypotheticals of persecution of some poor person who, took a left turn where it was prohibited on a one-way street. But instead, what we've got is we had a situation in which actually Judge Florence Pan asked a really direct question in the oral argument in the DC Circuit. Basically what you're saying to Trump's lawyers, she said, basically what you're saying is that Trump could use SEAL Team 6 and take out his political opponent and he'd be immune from prosecution. And they said yes. Basically, that's what their argument boils down to.
That caught my eye too, because the answer was, the president can order out assassinations without any fear of criminal prosecution unless he's first impeached by the House of Representatives in a majority vote and then convicted in a trial in the Senate by 2/3, something that has never happened in American history of a U.S. president. And we had the strongest cross-party coalition voting to convict in the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump, but we were still 10 votes short, so we didn't come close. But if a president were afraid that he might actually be impeached and convicted, of course, that ruling invited by Trump's lawyers would counsel the president to assassinate members of the House and the Senate. In other words, if you think that there are enough people to vote against you to be convicted, and then thereby put you in jeopardy of prosecution, just go ahead and shoot them, and you can't be prosecuted for that either.
It's so mind blowing to even think that's the possibility that not only has been floated by Trump's lawyers, but has been perhaps will be embraced by the Supreme Court. Maybe we'll find out tomorrow.
The questions that Justice Alito was asking were astounding. I mean, he was saying, well, if you hold a president accountable by making him subject to prosecution, at that point, he would have no incentive to leave office. You would increase the chances that he would use violence to stay in. So in other words, if we weren't so mean to these violent, pathological would-be dictators, if we didn't threaten them with consequences, they might be willing to leave office voluntarily. But it's only because they're facing the possibility of prosecution that they are starting to try to use violence against us, like what happened on January 6th. If we accept that kind of right-wing constitutional masochism, and people just accept that with a straight face, then we're in real danger as a country.
Well, why don't we talk about that for a second, since you mentioned Justice Alito, and the fact that Justice Alito, who has been really out there himself, was recently taped talking about a kind of an us versus them world that he sees. And the Supreme Court apparently is protecting his vision of a theocracy in the United States against all of the rest of us who might think otherwise. And you have recently had a roundtable on just this question about what do we do about the Supreme Court, and it's not just about the outcomes of these particular cases, but it's overall what should a Supreme Court look like in a democracy? Can you describe some of the reforms that you might embrace?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we should talk about it. People can understand that we are not without hope. There are some pathways through this thing. On the other hand, I don't want people to get too focused on it now, because we've got to really keep our focus on winning the election. And anytime we talk about any reforms to the Supreme Court, the other side starts whining about court packing and court stacking, which of course is precisely what they've engaged in, as when they sandbagged my constituent, Merrick Garland, who was one of the most qualified people ever nominated to the Supreme Court, and he was kept from even getting a hearing for 11 months when he was nominated to replace Justice Scalia by President Obama in February of 2016. And then, of course, they rammed through in October of 2020, several weeks before the election, the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. But look, let's start with this. The number of justices on the court is not in the Constitution. That's always been set by statute. It's changed 9 or 10 different times in our history. We have 9 justices, but we have 13 federal circuits. I love to visit New York as much as the next person, but the idea that we have 5 justices just from New York, essentially 1 for each borough, just makes no sense from the standpoint of the rest of the country, right? And so one thing we could do is we could say, let's move to 13 justices. We'll make sure that every circuit has got to be covered. So there's at least 1 justice who was a citizen of each of the federal circuits, and we can move to 18-year terms. We comply with the life tenure and good faith provision by saying if they want to keep being a judge, they can be a judge on the district court or the circuit court. And each president will get 2 appointments. So we regularize it rather than make it a matter of political strategy and intrigue. Who's going to, how long can somebody make it? Can they talk somebody off the court? Can we induce somebody off the court and all that stuff? We get out of that, and we just say each president will get 2 justices, which might even lead to a somewhat more rational confirmation process for the justices. And then we spread it out across the country. And so this might be a good moment to do it with an ethics crisis on the court, which has blown up into a full legitimacy crisis. We've got the highest court in the land with the lowest ethical standards, and everybody knows it. AOC and I just introduced at the beginning of the week legislation to have the $50 gift ban, which governs members of Congress, apply also to the Supreme Court. Why is Justice Thomas taking not just hundreds of thousands, but millions of dollars in so-called gifts from so-called friends when a member of Congress would be going to jail for that? And members of Congress have gone to jail for that. You can't take that money. So we can do up to $50. Most members don't even do that, don't want to go anywhere near it. And that's the right way of thinking about it.
Well, I have to say, being somewhat cynical or extremely cynical about the Supreme Court, I think that's why they have been on a rampage against the corruption laws. They have put a stake in the heart of efforts by the federal government to constrain corruption, because, guess what? They don't see it. Taking money from as a gift doesn't look like a bribe to them somehow.
I mean, they've done it in case after case. So the McDonald case from Virginia, they did it yesterday, basically saying that a late bribe is just a gratuity. It's to ensure prompt service and a little tip you get after the fact. This has been going on for a long time. And it's hard for me to believe that Alito and Thomas ruled on that case without thinking about their own situations. And I can't believe any of them ruled on it without thinking about the situation of Jared Kushner, who, after being the Middle East czar for the Trump administration, cozying up to Saudi Arabia, making that the first place that President Trump visited when he was in office, after covering up the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, after rendering all these favors to Saudi Arabia, and then a few months later, after they leave office, brings back a cool $2 billion from Saudi Arabia. Oh, well, it's not a bribe. That's just a gratuity. I mean, that's an arm's length business transaction. I mean, come on.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, so I know I can monopolize you for your entire time, but I know there are people hungry to ask questions that are on the call. So I'm going to turn it over to the Big Tent folks, to Melissa, I think, to bring you some questions from the many people we have attending.
Representative Raskin, we only have you for a little bit of time, so I did want to ask you a few things. There are some questions in the chat around preparing for the 2020 election and what has Congress done to ensure that the election will get certified, and what should we be paying attention to as we get closer post-election to allow for certification?
So thank you for the question. Check out the reforms we made to the Electoral Count Act. There are a lot of smaller reforms that have been instituted. We have enunciated the obvious in many cases, like saying the vice president has no authority to take the football and run away with it and just declare whoever he or she wants to be president to be president. We also increase the number of members who must object to a state certification before it even is entered into a question for Congress. Excuse me. So there are a number of smaller things like that. The bottom line, though, is that there's not a lot that can be done if you've got a strategic bad faith actor who's willing to destroy all the rules. So we've toughened up the rules the best that we can, but the Electoral College is a creaky and antiquated institution.
Yeah, and it's nerve-wracking. Please feel free to get a drink of water. I mean, because I ask a long-winded question. So, Caroline, you at the Brennan Center have been thinking about reform and court reform. So I'd like to just, since we were sort of talking about, term limits, and Representative Raskin, you can weigh in too. Can you guys give us just a quick overview of what it would be to have a real ethics reform at the court for the Supreme Court?
I think I would want to defer to Congressman Raskin, who's just introduced legislation on it, but just to say, I think everything he's mentioned so far is exactly on point. It's a basket of things. Ethics reform should, in my mind, be low-hanging fruit. That should have been done long ago. It seems obvious, I think, to any rational person that justices and judges shouldn't be able to accept large gifts from people who have interests before the court, and then not tell anybody about them. I don't think it's just about disclosure. I think it should be an outright ban, just as the congressman said. I don't really understand. And trying to claim that somehow the Supreme Court can't be regulated by Congress. I mean, what version of the Constitution did Justice Alito read? That's insane. You just have to read the actual words of Article 3 to see, who sets up the Supreme Court's jurisdiction, if not Congress. Well, it's right there in black and white. So, I think it's pretty clear that Congress, one of the easiest things it could do is the ethics reform. And then, of course, term limits, I think, are also go without saying. It's just absolutely commonsensical. We are the only, one of the only democratic or semi-democratic countries in the world that has a life tenure system for our highest court. And we have only one of our state Supreme Courts that has that, which I think is Rhode Island. It's completely unusual and for a reason, because it's just not good policy or practice to have somebody who has absolute power for the entirety of their life. It can't be removed except through impeachment, which, guess what? In the United States, we have never impeached a justice. So it's not exactly an effective mechanism to control bad actors.
Yeah. Representative Raskin, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, we've got a bunch of different bills that are in there. One is for an inspector general in the Supreme Court, which seems like an obvious thing to do, which would clean things up rather quickly when you think about it. Another possibility is to have a binding ethics tribunal made up of members of the federal circuit courts. You could take one from each of the 13 circuits, or 9 circuits, whatever. The point is, right now, each of them is a justice reviewing his or her own ethics conflicts. It makes no sense.
Yeah. So we have had a lot of court decisions, and I'd love to have, before we lose you, Representative Raskin, if you're okay, just weigh in on a few of those for us. What should we, what is something we might have missed? What was good news? What was bad news? Just give us a quick overview of what's happened so far.
Caroline, you go first if you would.
Okay, well, we've talked about a few of them. I think an area where I think people should be really very cynical, as I said before, is on abortion, and the fact that we had these 2 cases, and one dealt with medication abortion, which is the FDA versus Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, in which is a case in which the far right is actually trying to make it virtually impossible for people to get abortion care via telemedicine or self-administer these kinds of medications at home. And the Supreme Court did not say that the FDA can continue to have this regulation. They simply said that, and again, this was a crazy case. They simply said that the group of doctors that brought the case didn't have standing. That is, they didn't have an interest sufficient to qualify them to bring a case before the court. You actually have to be harmed by something in order to bring a case under our system. And what they said was, we don't like it. We don't like abortion, and we're doctors. And therefore, we should be able to stop the FDA. And so all the court said was, well, you can't just say just because you're doctors and you don't like abortion doesn't give you standing. So let's not be happy about that, because that one is coming back. And all they did was set it up for a post-election return by a better set of plaintiffs on their side. I mean, they could have done that one better. And they kind of screwed it up in terms of which case got to the court. And the same with EMTLA, with the emergency care for women. That's at issue in Idaho, where they've banned virtually all abortions, even for women who might have a wanted pregnancy, but have had such a problem with their pregnancy that their life or health is in extreme danger. And Idaho wants to say, no, sorry, you still can't get abortion care. And so EMTLA is this Emergency Medicine Act, which ensures that people who are in such dire straits, if they go to a hospital that's getting any kind of federal support, should be able to access the care that they need. The Supreme Court didn't say EMTLA triumphs and women should be able to get care. Women shouldn't have to die just because their pregnancy went wrong. If they're in Idaho or one of the many other states that has since banned abortion. No, all they said was the case needs to go back down for further hearings. And so the law in Idaho can't be enforced for some time. Well, so again, don't get excited, just hold on for the election. And I think, as Congressman Raskin said, the election is the only thing that's going to determine whether or not EMTLA, whether emergency care for those who've had a dangerous pregnancy is going to be available. The only thing that's going to determine that is this election, because after the election, all hell is going to break loose with the Supreme Court.
Kitty, I want to talk about a good news case if I could, all right?
Oh, yay. Please do.
Well, it's good news in the sense that the Supreme Court actually followed precedent and the logic of the First Amendment instead of completely buckling under to a right-wing extremist agenda so deranged that it really would immediately threaten the integrity of our institutions. So in Murthy versus Missouri, the right-wingers were arguing that it violates the First Amendment, check this out, for government officials to alert people in the social media or people in the public that a foreign actor, say Vladimir Putin, is distributing propaganda and disinformation online. So say a nefarious foreign actor like Vladimir Putin is putting disinformation online, telling people that the election is next Wednesday instead of next Tuesday. And if the government, if a state board of elections wants to say there's disinformation online, the election is not Wednesday, it's Tuesday, the right-wingers in this case were arguing that violates the First Amendment rights of Putin or the First Amendment right of the people to receive disinformation, but the government can't do that. Or in the public health context, if people are saying it is safe to inject yourself with bleach or hydroxychloroquine is the recommended government prescription for COVID or what have you, the government, on their view, could not correct the misinformation because that would violate the First Amendment. That is a position so extreme and so designed to undermine our political and social and scientific institutions at the hands of foreign despots and dictators that even a few of the Republican justices came over. And so in a 6-3 decision, the court rejected it. Now, they rejected it just on the threshold issue of standing, saying that the people in the states that brought the case were not directly injured and couldn't show the requisite standing to raise it. So I suppose the underlying substantive allegation is still out there. But it is, very much good news in this terrible news court that they didn't go that far. And I got to believe something vaguely similar will happen in the presidential immunity case. I mean, I think that they will slice the bologna real fine, requiring all kinds of remands to figure out exactly, was Trump acting in his public or his non-public, his private or his political capacity, and they will look for, further fact-finding and so on. But they'll basically uphold the idea that nobody's above the law. But then again, people accuse me of being a rose-colored glasses optimist all the time. I do believe that they understand they are in a tremendous legitimacy crisis right now. And so they are looking for ways to try to repair the damage after the Dobbs decision, after the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment decision, after Bush versus Gore, really. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. I wrote a book called Overruling Democracy, the Supreme Court versus the American People, back in 2003, after the 2000 election, but they've been systematically cutting away at the voting rights of the people, overturning majority Black and Hispanic congressional districts, a process that continued again into this term of the Supreme Court, where they say, well, if a state decides to lop off hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of African-American voters from a particular congressional district, shifting it from a majority Democratic, minority influenced or majority Black district to a majority white Republican district, that's not racial in nature. That's just partisan. That's political. And this court, of course, celebrates partisan gerrymandering. That's de rigueur. Of course, you can gerrymander for party purposes. And so now all you've got to do in order to dismantle Black or Hispanic majorities to say, oh, we're reassigning those citizens not because of what their race or ethnic group membership is, just because disproportionate numbers of them are Democrats. And so they're just trying to gerrymander them into oblivion because of their party label. And that's perfectly legit.
Representative Raskin, I know you have to go. Can you give us something we need to be hopeful or should be hopeful about? Because I know we all get a little down sometimes at the Big Tent, although we're a Big Tent, we're fighting really hard. So last words before we let you go. Representative Raskin, a moment of thought of hope, please.
Well, I'm happy to answer your question, but first, will you answer me one? How many people do we have on our call tonight?
We were 589.
Well, I've got 589 reasons for hope. When I was growing up, my dad used to say to us, when everything looks hopeless, you're the hope. And the people on this call are the hope, the people who still read the Constitution and follow the Supreme Court, as dreadful as it has become, the people who are still demanding high standards of democratic institutions and want to make them produce for the people. So I've been to 21 states now in this presidential campaign. I've been traveling all over the country, and I derive amazing hope from the surging crowds of people who are out there, the activists, the people who are fighting for real justice and to defend our constitutional democracy. And we just launched our Democracy Summer Project with more than 1,000 young people working in campaigns in 45 states all over the country. And it's amazing. And that's a generation that is beyond racism and anti-Semitism and immigrant bashing and misogyny. And unfortunately, they're a little bit beyond grammar too, but that's a different problem. And, that's all because of the texting and the tweeting and everything. But the young generation gives me a lot of hope. And the prior generations who've preceded us, who've been up against enormous odds, the people who've waged the civilizing movements of American history, the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the LGBTQ movement, and the environmental movement, the human rights movement. I mean, these are the movements that have made America truly extraordinary. And this is what American exceptionalism is all about. It's not that we somehow have some magic immunity to fascism. Obviously, we don't. But it's because the people have engaged in struggles to create a more perfect union. And so I believe that project continues. Democracy is not just this static collection of democratic political institutions, although it is that, it is also an unfinished project. It's a work in motion, and we've got a lot of different places to go. And we have a whole world to save, because we haven't even gotten really to talk in this campaign about climate change. But if our brains were bigger, if our species were just a little bit smarter, it's all anybody would be talking about. And we would be able to get through the war, the racism, the anti-Semitism, the fascism a lot more quickly if we understood that we're in an emergency right now.
But thank you so much.